In the summer of 1683, Europe stood on the edge of extinction. Across the plains of Hungary, the ground shook beneath one of the largest armies the early modern world had ever seen. Over 150,000 Ottoman soldiers marching west in an unbroken river of steel and banners. For 3 straight hours, their columns passed a single point. It was more than an invasion. It was a statement. The Ottoman Empire was coming for the golden apple of Europe, Vienna. At the head of this vast war machine rode Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a commander whose ambition was nothing less than world dominion. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany would lie open. If Vienna fell, Italy would tremble. If Vienna fell, Western Europe itself might collapse. This wasn't just a siege. It was a civilizational crossroads. And yet, Europe did nothing. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured, princes arguing while their borders burned. The emperor himself fled Vienna. The Italian states were too busy bickering over old rivalries, and France, Europe's most powerful nation, watched from the shadows, unwilling to help its longtime rival Austria. A continent that had spent decades tearing itself apart with religious wars suddenly found itself paralyzed, staring into the jaws of an empire that had never been stopped. Vienna stood alone, but history often turns on a single decision, a single moment when one leader chooses to act while others hesitate. That man was King John III Sobieski of Poland. When every political calculation said, "Stay out," Sobieski looked at the map of Europe, looked at the desperate pleas coming from Vienna, and said no. Not today. Not on his watch. He gathered his army, rallied the famed Polish Hussars, and began a march that would become one of the most significant rescue operations in military history. For if Vienna fell, the balance of the world would fall with it. But if Vienna could stand, if Europe could unite, even for a single moment, everything could change. And so begins the story of the battle that saved Europe, the clash where empires collided and the future of the continent hung by a thread. While Europe remained paralyzed, one man refused to look away. King John III Sobieski of Poland, a warrior who had fought in more than 30 battles, a man as defined by his unshakable faith as by his sword, knew that Vienna's fall would not just redraw borders, it would rewrite civilization. Sobieski wasn't the richest king. He didn't command the largest army. Poland itself was battered and starving after years of war, but when every other ruler hesitated, calculating politics, alliances, and personal gain, Sobieski saw only one truth. Good men do not wait for permission when evil is at the gates. With little more than conviction and courage, he ordered the longest forced march in Polish history, a desperate race across mountains and rivers to reach Vienna before it collapsed. And along the way, something extraordinary happened. Armies began to follow him, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, soldiers from the fractured German states, not because they were ordered to, but because Sobieski's purpose gave them something Europe had lost: hope. He marched not for glory, not for territory, but because he understood the moment demanded it. And in doing so, he became the reluctant savior Europe didn't deserve, but desperately needed. While Sobieski raced toward destiny, Vienna descended into hell. The Ottoman cannons, some of the largest in the world, pounded medieval walls never designed to withstand gunpowder siege warfare. Homes collapsed, streets turned to rubble, food vanished, people boiled leather belts for soup, rats became a delicacy, disease stalked every corner of the starving city. Inside the chaos, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, Vienna's military governor, stood like a granite pillar. His diary entries describe not just fear, but the terrifying clarity of a man who knows he may witness the death of his own civilization. Yet even as thousands died, he refused to surrender. Outside the walls, the Ottomans grew complacent. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha transformed the siege into a theatrical display of power, hosting diplomats, living in luxury, confident that time itself would hand him victory. He didn't need to storm the city, he thought. Hunger would fight for him, but as Vienna struggled to take its final breaths, a distant thunder began rolling over the mountains. Not weather, not cannons, cavalry. Sobieski was coming, and then, riding out of legend itself, came the warriors who would carve their names into eternity, the winged Hussars. Europe's last true knights. They did not creep onto the battlefield. They announced themselves, steel armor gleaming, wings of wood and eagle feathers rising behind their backs like the silhouettes of angels or avenging spirits. These wings were not decoration, they were weapons. When the Hussars charged, the wind roared through the feathers, creating a terrifying howl that rolled across the battlefield. Part thunder, part scream, all psychological warfare. They carried 18-foot lances, longer than anything wielded by any cavalry in the world. Lances designed to shatter shields, bone and morale alike. And these weren't ordinary soldiers. They were nobles, landowners, warriors born into privilege who chose hardship instead of comfort. When Sobieski called, they did not ask for payment. They strapped on their armor, mounted their chargers, and rode 500 miles across mountains, storms, and endless forests, an odyssey retold as if the earth itself bent beneath their determination. Their march was not a military maneuver. It was a prayer written in mud, sweat, and willpower. By September 11th, the impossible had happened. Sobieski and Duke Charles of Lorraine united their armies outside Vienna. 27,000 Christian soldiers, Polish, Austrian, Bavarian, Saxon, faced 80,000 entrenched Ottoman troops, veterans of countless conquests. The night before the battle, something extraordinary occurred. Catholics and Protestants, people who had slaughtered each other for generations, knelt together in the cold grass and prayed, not as rivals, but as men who understood they might be witnessing the last dawn of their world. The plan was simple, almost reckless. Attack at noon, break the siege, or die trying. And then came the moment that shattered history. As the sun dipped low, 3,000 winged hussars emerged from the tree line above Vienna, lances leveled, wings roaring in the wind. Behind them thundered 18,000 more cavalry, a tidal wave of armor and horseflesh. The ground itself shook. Ottoman lines buckled. The famed Ottoman cavalry broke within minutes, crushed beneath the momentum of a charge that had no equal. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, formed their ranks, bracing for impact. But nothing could stop the Polish wedge. Steel met flesh, lances shattered, horses crashed through 3 defensive lines, and in a single, unstoppable push, the entire Ottoman army collapsed into chaos. The greatest cavalry charge in human history had just rewritten the future of Europe. As the dust of the cavalry charge settles, the impossible comes into focus. Kara Mustafa Pasha, commander of one of the largest armies the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe, stands frozen in disbelief. Hours earlier, he believed victory was guaranteed. Vienna starved, Europe divided, his army unchallenged. Now, his perfect plan dissolves into a nightmare. The proud Ottoman war machine, invincible for over 2 centuries, is shattered. More than 15,000 Ottomans lie dead on the field. Tens of thousands more flee in chaos, abandoning their camp, their banners, their weapons, and most symbolically, the golden apple promised by the Sultan, the trophy of a conquered Vienna. Mustafa does not stay to fight. He does not rally his men. He runs, leaving behind maps, treasure, and the dream of Ottoman Europe burning in the sunset. Vienna is saved. Europe is saved. And history pivots in a single afternoon. As twilight falls on September 12, 1683, King Jan III Sobieski enters the broken gates of Vienna. The city is barely alive, starving, ruined, soaked in smoke and blood. Yet when its people see the Polish king, they collapse around him in tears. Some fall to their knees, others reach for his armor. Many kiss the hooves of his horse, sobbing with relief. Sobieski, exhausted and covered in dust, dismounts and walks into St. Stephen's Cathedral. There, beneath shattered stained glass and drifting ash, he kneels before the altar and whispers the words that will echo for centuries. Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came. I saw. God conquered. Not I conquered. Not Poland conquered. Not the alliance conquered. God conquered. It is a statement of humility and a recognition that this victory transcended human strategy. It was courage, unity, and faith woven together in a single moment. The unstoppable Ottoman tide that had crushed kingdoms and empires for generations never rose again. The Siege of Vienna was not just a military victory. It was the turning point that preserved the map of Europe as we know it today. A day when a reluctant king, a starving city, and an army of winged knights changed the fate of the world. And so the story ends with a tribute, not to empires, but to the men who stood when all seemed lost. The thunder that saved Vienna was more than cannon fire. It was the thunder of hooves, of faithful hearts, of warriors who understood that some moments are worth dying for. The Siege of Vienna becomes more than history. It becomes a reminder. Darkness can be driven back, but only when good men stand together and ride into the storm.